How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Beis, Daf 2 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, this is exciting times. New Masechta Shish. After Masechta Horius. Whoa! Wow! That was a tough Masechta Horius. 2 weeks, but a tough 2 weeks. So now we are starting Masechta Zevachim. Very excited about this. Seder Kodshim. Mamish. Seder Kodshim. Chaver, this is like the last. This is like the. Did I lose my voice again? But I don't think I lost. I think I'm all right. But I don't think I'm losing it like in the way that I lost like 2 weeks ago. That was rough. Still haven't really gotten back. But it's late. It's 9:30 p.m. already. Just getting started. But anyways, my whole schedule's been whack. But I'll upon him. Seder Kodshim is like the last big, like, frontier ahead of us, right? We've already learned Zraim, which is really just Masechta Brachis, and we've learned Moed, we've learned Noshim, we've learned Nizikin, and today we're beginning Kodshim, which is really the last full Seder that we have ahead of us. After Kodshim, there's really just Nida left. And then, Chevra, we have learned Shas. So, this is exciting times. We're going to be learning, this year, or mamash, we're getting up to Rosh Hashanah. This year is going to be all about Masechta Zevachim, Masechta Menachis, and Masechta Chulin. That's what this year is going to be about. After Masechta Chulin, it's really just cleaning up. We got a bunch of smaller Masechtas like Bechoris and Arachin and things like that. Today, this year ahead of us is the last like real year of like big Masechtas. This is it, Chevre. We're in Kodshim. We got this year is going to be like a big year of 3 big Masechtas in Seder Kodshim. And then after that, it's really, we're already moving into wrap-up mode. So it's exciting times here on Babble on Talmud. Chevre. Babble on Talmud. Chevre. Let us begin today's daf. Today we are going to start with an introduction to Masechta Zevachim. It's not going to be an introduction to the entire Masechta because A, it's a pretty big Masechta, and B, I've only learned like the first 7 daf so far. But it's going to be we're going to do an introduction here just to kind of get the ball rolling over here, give us a little bit of a running start. We'll discuss some of the key important concepts to introduce us and get our heads into Kodshim mode. Then we will begin Daf Beis. We will learn the first daf of Masechta Zevachim. We will discuss slaughtering a korbin with the wrong intent, which we will also already be discussing a bit in the introduction. We will discuss slaughtering a korbin with no intent at all. Okay? And finally, writing a writ of divorce with no intent at all. We will discuss these topics on today's daf. Chevra, without further ado, let us jump in to the introduction to Masechta Zevachim. Gewaldig. Okay, before we begin the introduction, I just want to make 2 comments. One, of course, is that if anybody's in a rush and does it and wants to skip the introduction, just go into the description of today's daf where you will find the different sections of the daf and you can skip to the next section. Although I do recommend the introduction, which is why I prepared it. I think, it'll be a good introduction to concepts that are going to be coming up today in the short term, in the long term. So, I do suggest you stick around with us. But if you need to skip it, you have how to do so in the sections in the description of the daf. And secondly, if anybody has an art scroll Gemara, there is a very excellent and thorough introduction to Seder Kodshim and Masechta Zevachim in the art scroll. It's big and it's thorough. I mean, I'm actually still not done with it. I have 1 section left. There's 10 sections. I have 1 section left. I've been I've been reading through it a little bit in increments over the past several days. It's dense, but it's very good. I highly recommend, if anybody has an Art Scroll Gemara, to spend some time reading through the introduction there. It's very thorough. Okay, friends, let us jump into the introduction to Masechta Zevachim. Our introduction will have 3 sections to it. Section number 1, we will discuss briefly the types of korbanis that there are. In the next section, we will discuss pigul. Now, pigul must have come up a few times over the past few years. Now, we aren't going to be discussing, pigul will not immediately come up in our Gemara, though I've mentioned that I've been learning Mishnayos Yomi recently, and we're Menachis right now, but we recently learned Zevachim, so I know that pigul that we're gonna spend plenty of time in Masechta Zevachim learning about pigul, even if we're not going to discuss it immediately. However, the reason why I included it in the introduction is because in understanding pigul, we'll understand many of the important stages of offering a korbin, and that will already, all those pieces, even if pigul itself is not a sugya we're going to be jumping into immediately, but the pigul involves a lot of details, a lot of moving pieces that have to do with offering korbanis, and therefore, through understanding pigul, we can understand a lot about korbanis, which is why I included it here. And finally, lishma, which will already be the focus of today's daf, of daf Beis of Masechta Zevachim. The first mission of Masechta Zevachim is already going to be talking about the concept of lishma and offering a korban with the right intentions, which will also build upon some of the things that we learned through when discussing pigul. Okay, let us jump into section 1, types of korbanos. I'm just going to grab a little water. Okay, section number 1, types of korbanos. Okay, so in broad strokes, there are 2 general categories when it comes to korbanos. You have your kadshe kadshim and your kadshim kalim. Just al regel achas for now. Kadshe kadshim are generally more stringent, a higher level. It's already in our mission. The first mission of Zevachim already is going to discuss how kind of kadshim is on a higher level than kadshim kalim. Kadshim kalim are kind of on a lower level. So kadshe kadshim are more holy, more strict. Kadshim kalim are less strict. Let's just stick with that for now. Now, there are also 8 types of korbanos. Those 8 are, and I've also color-coded them, okay? Kadshe kadshim is in pink, and so the 3 pink korbanos are the kadshe kadshim korbanos, and the gold ones are the kadshim kalim korbanos. So there are 8 types of korbanos, 3 kadshe kadshim, and 5 kadshim kalim. The 3 kadshe kadshim korbanos are a korbin ola, a korbin chatos, a korbin ashim. Those are kadshe kadshim. And a shlamim, a toda, a bechor, a meiser, a pesach, without getting into the details right now of what all those korbanos are, we'll get to them as we get to them, but those all are kadshim kalim. What are some differences between kadshe kadshim and kadshim kalim? Well, for example, whereas kadshim kalim can be slaughtered anywhere in the azara of the Beis HaMikdash, kadshe kadshim have to dafka be slaughtered, and the Kabbalah Sadam in the north of the azara of the Beis HaMikdash. That's one example. Another example is kadshim kalim can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim, within the walls of Yerushalayim. Whereas a korban ola, for example, isn't eaten at all. It's entirely just burnt on the mizbeach in the azara. Achatos and ashim are only eaten by kohanim, and they have to be eaten in the azara. They can't just be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. So there are more stringencies when it comes to kadshe kadshim as opposed to kadshim kalim. So in broad strokes, there's 2 categories of korbanos: kadshe kadshim, which is the more stringent ones, and that's ola, chatas, and asham, and then kadshim kalim, which is shlamim, toda, bechor, meiser, and pesach. Givaldik. Okay. Now, moving on to section 2 of our introduction to Zevachim, Pigul. Okay, now Pigul is going to be, there's going to be a bunch of parts here. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the reason why I included Pigul in the introduction is because in understanding Pigul, we have to understand many of the components of offering a korbin. So let us jump into that. So the process of offering a korbin can be divided into 3 stages. Avodas Hadam, the avodas related to the blood, and we will explain those in a minute. We'll elaborate on that in a minute. And then after the avodas related to the blood, there is the haktaras emurim, the burning of certain parts of the korbin, depending on the korbin on the mizbeach. Of course, when many of us think of korbanos, that's what we think of, even though actually it's not the most important part of the korbin. But I think when many of us think of a korbin, we think of the mizbeach and the Beis HaMikdash and animals and meat and burning. It's interesting. We're going to see already today, and Daf Beis Amud Beis, we're going to quote a Mishnah from Daf Mem Vav of Amud Beis of Masechta Zevachim, where actually one of the requirements of a korbin is that it has to be reach, nichayach, a reach, a smell. You want to have that smell of the barbecue meat, right? So that's the haktaras emurim that you're gonna, there's going to be burning of certain parts of the animal on the mizbeach, and finally achila, eating the korbin. Not every korbin is eaten, but those that are eaten are eaten. So now, to elaborate on these 3 sections of avodas hadam, haktaras emurim, and achila. So the avodas, there are 4 parts of avodas hadam, and this is very important. This is very important because it's going to be a bit, these are going to come up all over the show. This is very important, that when you offer a korbin, the first avodas that you do when offering a korbin is number 1, shchita. You slaughter the korbin. Now, technically, shchita is kosher bizarre. It doesn't have to be done by a kohen. Even a non-kohen can do shchita. But anyways, the first avodas hadam is shchita, and then kabbalah. Kabbalah is that immediately after slitting the throat of the animal and the blood is gushing out, that blood is collected in a vessel, in a klesharis. That's what's called kabbalah sadam, receiving the blood. Once the blood has been received, you then have holacha sadam, bringing the blood over to the mizbeach. Now, interestingly, of all the avodas hadams, holacha sadam is actually the only one that, technically speaking, doesn't need to be done. What does that mean? Well, if you slaughter a korbin right next to the mizbeach, and you're physically already there, so the fact that you're not actually going to need to walk there, you're already there, is no problem. So in that case, don't do halacha. That's fine. You have to slaughter. You have to do kabbalah sadam. You have to do zrika sadam. Halacha is the only one that, technically speaking, if you're already there, okay, no big deal. Don't worry about halacha. And then finally, zrika sadam. I put zrika sadam in bold because zrika sadam actually is the most important part of the korbin. The pasuk says, "Ki adam hu banefesh yichaper." Now, I can't say for sure that that's the pasuk that this is learned out from, but the point is that the zrika sadam is really the key, right? We think of korbanos, as I mentioned a minute ago, that you have the mizbeach and you burn the meat on the mizbeach. That's offering a korbin. The fact of the matter is, the key part of this whole shebang of the kabbalah sadam, of the avodas hadam, and the haktaras emurim, and the achila, the key step here in all of this is actually zrika sadam, throwing the blood on the mizbeach. That is where the kapara, that's where the kapara is. So the final of the avodas hadam is zrika sadam, throwing the blood. Although depending on the korbin, actually the way that the blood is applied to the mizbeach is going to differ based on different korbanos, but applying the blood to the mizbeach is the zrika sadam, and that is the most crucial part of the whole Maaseh korbanos, the whole offering of the korbin. So those are the avodas hadam: the shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. Now, Haktoras emurim, as we've said, is the parts of the animal that will go on the mizbeach. I believe almost every a chatas ha'of. I believe chatas ha'of, actually none of it goes on the mizbeach, but other than that, probably I think maybe every korbin has something that goes on the mizbeach. An ola is, for example, entirely burnt on the mizbeach. A korbin chatas will have certain fats and things that are burnt on the mizbeach, and the rest will be eaten by the kohanim. Different korbanos have different parts that go on the mizbeach. That's the aktoras emurim. And finally, achila. Not all korbanos are eaten. Korban olas are burnt entirely on the mizbeach, for example. But if you have a korban chatas or korban asham, those will be eaten by the kohanim. If you have a shlomim, if you have a korban shlomim, so part of it will be burnt on the mizbeach. And then, what did I say? Korban shlomim. So part of it will be burnt on the mizbeach. Part of it will be eaten by the kohanim. The kohanim would get the chazav ashok, the breast and the back right thigh, and then the rest will go to the owners. So different korbanos can be eaten, and that would be the eating of the korbin. So, to recap before moving on, the process of offering a korbin can be divided into three stages. There's the avodas hadam, the pinnacle of which being the zrikas hadam, and then there's aktoras emurim and achila. Now, tying this all together, we get now to pigul. What is pigul? Let me actually drink a little bit more water. Now, a korbin is pigul. Listen up, friends. Listen up, friends. We're going to take all the things that we just built up to, everything we just built up to now. This is important. It's not so hard, but it is also technical at the same time. So listen up. There's going to be one part of it that's a little bit subtle, but here we go. You ready? A korbin is pigul when any of the avodas hadam, that's shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, if any of those avodas has been performed with the intention of performing any of zrika sadam, haktoras emurim, achila, beyond its allotted time frame. We'll talk in a minute about what the time frames are. But if you slaughter an animal with the intention of doing zrika sadam outside of its allotted time, past its allotted time, or you slaughter the animal with the intention of burning the emurin outside of its allotted time, or eating it outside of its allotted time, that will be pigul. Now, just like it can be pigul if you do that during shchita, also if you do it during kabbalah or halacha. Now, when it comes to zrika sadam, so zrika sadam is actually one of the things that can make pigul, right? If you slaughter it with the intention of doing zrika sadam outside the allotted time, that would be pigul, right? But again, the main things are that you do one of the avodas hadams, right? Pigul is affected based on the kavanah that one has during the avodas hadam. Okay, so if you do any of the avodas hadam, so I just talked about shchita, but even if you do kabbalah sadam with the intention of eating the korbin when it's too late, that will be pigul. Now, when it comes to zrika sadam, so again, as I said, zrika sadam is actually one of the things. Okay, if you do shchita with the intention of doing zrika sadam too late, it would be pigul. But zrika sadam is also one of the avodas hadam. If you throw the blood on the mizbeach with the intention of eating it or burning the emurin outside of its allotted times, that will also be pigul, right? So if you do any of the avodas hadams with the intention of doing any of either zrika sadam, haktoras emurin, or achila of the korbin beyond its allotted time frame, that's pigul. That's it. That's pigul. So there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different steps involved in sort of defining pigul, but that's it. It's basically doing any of the avodas hadams with the intention of either doing zrika sadam or haktoras emurin or eating the korbin outside of the allotted time to do so. That's pigul. Now, eating a korbin, I have a typo here. Eating a korbin that is pigul carries a chiyuv kares. Okay, so if you slaughtered a korbin with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam outside the allotted time, it's pigul. If you then eat that korbin, there's a chiyuv kares. There's a chiyuv kares. That korbin may not be in, it's a chiyuv kares. Now, to discuss these time frames, right, we said, again, what's pigul? Let's say I slaughter a korbin with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam outside its time frame, or Haptorah Semurin outside its time frame, or eating it outside its time frame. Each one has their own time frame. So Zrikas Adam must be performed before sundown the day the korbin was slaughtered, right? So if you slaughter the animal with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam after sundown, that's pigul. If you slaughter the animal with the intention of burning the fats, right, Haptorah Semurin must be performed before dawn, following the shechita of the korbin, right? So you have until the morning. So if you slaughter the animal with the intention of burning the emurim tomorrow morning, too late. That's pigul. The korbin must be eaten within 1 or 2 days, depending on the korbin. So again, if you slaughter the animal with so let's say you have a korbin shlomim, which you can eat for 2 days, you slaughter the animal with the intention of eating the korbin shlomim 3 days from now. That would be pigul. So again, if we take shechita, so if you slaughter the animal with the intention of doing either Zrikas Adam or Haptorah Semurim or eating the korbin outside of its allotted time, it will be pigul, and the allotted time for each of those things will differ based on whether it's Zrikas Adam or Haptorah Semurim or eating the korbin. But the point being that if you have the intention of Zrikas Adam or Haptorah Semurim or eating the korbin beyond the amount of time allowed for that particular thing that you're thinking about, then it will be pigul. Now, very similar to pigul, almost identical to pigul, is something that's called chutz limkomo. Okay, when we think about pigul, there's chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo. Chutz lizmano is what we just discussed, and that's pigul. Chutz lizmano, outside its allotted time, that's pigul. If you eat the korbin, it's a chiyuv kares. Very, very, very similarly, almost exactly the same, just instead of chutz lizmano, except instead of outside its allotted time, it's outside its allotted place. Okay? The thing, right? Okay, so let's define it. It's literally the same thing as pigul, just outside of its allotted place. A korbin is chutz limkomo when any of the avodas adam has been performed with the intention of performing any of either Zrikas Adam or Haptorah Semurim or Achila beyond its allotted location. Okay, we'll talk about the different locations in a second. Let me just drink a little bit more water. And in that case, eating a korbin, again, I got to fix the same typo from before. Eating a korbin that is chutz limkomo is simply a lav, okay? So while pigul is a chiyuv kares, if you eat a korbin that's chutz limkomo, it's a lav. It's a mitzvahs lo saseh. It's not a chiyuv kares, it's a mitzvahs lo saseh. And then, so in terms of outside of its location, so Zrikas Adam must be performed on the mizbeach in the azara. Haptorah Semurin must be performed on the mizbeach in the azara, although not for all korbanos, but anyways. Although, yeah, I guess Haptorah Semurim probably. Anyways, okay, let's say Haptorah Semurim must perform on the mizbeach in the azar, and achila is either in the azara if it's kodshe kodshin, or within the walls of Jerusalem if it's kodshim kalim. So again, if one does any of the avodas adam with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam or Haptorah Semurim or achila outside of the area that those things must be done, Zrikas Adam and Haptorah Semurim in the Azara, Achila, whether in the Azara or within the walls of Jerusalem, depending on the korbin. But if you do any of the avodas Adam with the intention of doing, either Zrikas Adam, Haptorah Semurim, Achila outside of the scope of where it's allowed, the location where it's allowed to be done, that would be chutz limkomo, and that would be a lav, right? That would be a lav mitzvahs lo sa'aseh. Okay, so that is be'etzen pigul. That is be'etzen pigul. And again, the reason why I wanted to discuss pigul now was because in discussing pigul, we touched upon a lot of things. We just talked about avodas adam, talked about shchita, kabbalas adam, olachas adam, zrikas adam, Haptorah Semurim, Achilas HaKorbin. We talked about chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, pigul, So we just covered a lot of really important Kodshim things, some of which are already going to be relevant in the very near future, others of which will be helpful to us as we continue to learn Masechta Zevachim. So we've already covered quite a bit, and now we are getting to the final section of the introduction to Masechta Zevachim, and that is the concept of Lishma. Drink a little more water. If any of the avodas hadam was performed with the explicit intention of a different type of korbin, it is not lishma. I'm going to read that again. If any of the avodas hadam, so whether that is shchita, kabbalah sadam, holacha sadam, zrika sadam, any of those were done with the explicit intention of a different type of korbin, then that means that the korbin was not lishma. For example, if a chatos was slaughtered with the express intention that it was being slaughtered as an ola. You have a korban chatos, and your intention expressly, and this already we're going to be discussing today. This is mamish the first mishnah of Masechta Zevachim, that you slaughter a korban chatos with the intention that you're slaughtering it as a korban ola. That korban is not lishma. You are slaughtering a korbin or doing any of the other avodas hadam as an ola, that is not lishma. And then, somewhat related, is the concept of l'shem bailim, which also is going to be coming up, I don't think today, but it's going to be coming up, I think maybe already, not tomorrow, within the next few days, it's already going to be coming up. So if any of the avodas hadam was performed on behalf of a different person, who is not the owner of the korbin, then it is not l'shem bailim. You're not doing the korbin for the owner of the korbin. So, for example, Reuven's chatos was slaughtered on behalf of Shimon, somebody else. So that is not l'shem bailim. Okay, and we're going to discuss the implications. Already, mamish, already the first mishnah of Masechta Zevachim, we're already going to be discussing what are the implications of a korban that is not lishma or not l'shem bailim. Cheve hatzloche. I hope we enjoy learning Masechta Zevachim. It's going to be gewaldig. It's going to be mamish gewalt. Let us jump in to the first mishnah, to Daf Beis of Masechta Zevachim. Okay, friends, let us begin the first mishnah of Masechta Zvachim kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman. So as I said, we are already going to be diving straight in to this concept of lishma. So it says the Mishnah kol hazvachim. Oh, now we had already learned in the introduction that there are 8 kinds of korbanos. Let me actually pull them up. We have 8 kinds of korbanos: the ola, chatos, osham, shlomim, todah, bechor, meiser, pesach. So any of those korbanos shenizbuchu shelo lishman, that were slaughtered shelo lishman. Says Rashi, shenishchat ola l'shem shlomim. For example, you're offering a korban shlom, ola, but when you slaughtered it, you had intention that you were slaughtering a korban shlom, even though it was a korban ola. So shenizbuchu shelo lishman, that they were slaughtered for the wrong intention, and ola was slaughtered as a shlomim, ksherim. So the korban is kosher. Korban is kosher. Ela shelo alu levaylim l'shem chov. Interesting. This is going to be coming up in the Gemara. There's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to korbanos. I'll tell you, these Gemaras they're not easy necessarily. Today isn't so hard, but the Gemaras are gewaldig, mamish gewaldig. But we're gonna have to use our noggins, We're gonna have to use our noggins. Anyways, so you hear this distinction. Ksherim, the korban is kosher. And let's actually read Rashi, because after we did our intro and we learned about the different stages of Ma'aseh korbanos, of offering a korban, let's actually look at this second Rashi, because we're going to see it's going to highlight the categories that we've discussed. So ksherim lizrok damon. So for example, if you slaughter, right, I'm reading the Mishnah, not anymore. So if you slaughter an ola with the intention of a shlamim, well, let's actually change that now because we're talking about eating it, and you don't eat an olah. So let's say you slaughter a shlamim with the intention of an olah. So ksherim lizrok daman. So even though you did the first activity of the korbin, you slaughtered it. You slaughtered a shlamim with the intention of an olah. Now what do you do? Do you proceed? Do you stop? Do you throw it in the garbage? What do you do? So we say ksherim. Don't throw nothing in the garbage. Proceed. Do the kabbalah sadam. Do the Allah sadam. Lizrok daman. Do zrika sadam. The key part of offering a korban, the zrika sadam. Do it. Go ahead. Do zrika sadam. Ulaktir emurein. Do aktaras emurein. V'lechol asen echolin. And whatever is eaten, depending on the korban, eat it. Avapi shemitzvasun l'sholchatan lishman kidal v'gemar. Even though really you should do these things lishman, you should slaughter a shlamim with the intention of a shlamim, or at least the kol pachot, not the intention of something else, of an olah, for example. So even so, if you did slaughter a shlamim with the intention of an olah, go weiter. Do zrikas adam, do aktaras emurin, eat the korban. But if the owner of the korban was obligated to bring that korban, he's going to have to bring a new one because it's right. Even though the animal is kosher and you can eat it, but it will not fulfill the obligation of the owner. So if the owner had said, I am going to bring a korban shlamim, and he brings this animal and he slaughters it as an olah, so while the korban is kosher and you can eat it, but you said you were going to bring a shlamim, you're gonna have to try again. You're gonna have to bring another animal, and this time, don't slaughter it as an olah. Okay, so again, any korban that was that was slaughtered shelo lishman, for example, a shlamim was slaughtered as an olah. Ksherim, the korban is still kosher. Go weiter, do zrikas adam, atar semurim, achilas korban. But the korban will not satisfy the obligation of the owner. And if the owner was obligated to bring a korban, this won't satisfy that obligation. He'll have to try again. He'll have to bring another korban for his chover. Chutz, now there are two exceptions to that rule. Right? We had said it's kosher, just shelo olav valim shem chova. There's two exceptions. There are two examples where it's possible. There are two examples where the korban is mamish going to be possible if it's shelo lishman. Chutz min ha-pesach ve'achatos ha-pesach bezmano ve'achatos b'chol zman. Let's drink some water. The two exceptions being a korban chatos, that if one needs to offer a korban chatos, let's say he ate chelet, class, right? Our favorite, our the example that we use all the time for korban chatos is person accidentally ate chelim, so he's bringing his korban chatos and he slaughters it as a shlum. Well, then it's mamish pasul. Don't stop. Don't move ahead. No, zrikas, just stop. It's ruined. Same thing for a korban pesach. Bizmana, kilu, on Erev Pesach, on Yudalit Benisan, Achar Sheshos, after 6 hours in the afternoon, Beino Arboim, when it's time to slaughter the korban pesach, you slaughter it as a shlum, or as an olah. Well then, also, forget about it, the korban is possible. Those are the two exceptions. So out of the 8 korbanis, the olah, chatas, ashram, shlom, torah, b'chor, ma'aser, pesach, there are 6 out of 8 of them. If you do any of the avoda sadam, shelo lishma, it's kosher al shelo olav valim shem chova. But by the chatos and by the pesach, this is important. By the chatos and by the korban pesach, if you do any of those avodas shelo lishman, throw the korban in the garbage. Rabbi Eliezer Omer after Osham. Rabbi Eliezer adds to the list in Osham as well, a chatos in Osham and a pesach. Ha pesach bizmano, korban pesach on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, at its little window of offering a korban pesach. Ve'achatas ve'osham b'chol zman, and achat, korban chatas, korban osham, whenever they need to be offered, if they're offered shelo lishman, they are psulin. Eliezer says, Eliezer achatas ba'a al chet ve'osham ba'a al chet. After all, a korban chatos. Why do you bring a korban chatos when one sins? Accidentally ate chelif, for example. A korban asham also comes based on a sin. A person needs to bring an asham ilos, for example. He unintentionally got benefit from hektish, from kodesh. So he has to bring a korban asham for that. So ma chatas psula shelo lishma. So just like a korban chatas, which comes for a sin, if one slaughters it or does the avodas adam shelo lishma, it's psula afa asham. So also an asham as well, which also comes for sins, pasul shelo lishma, will be pasul if any of the avodas adam was done shelo lishma. Although to this the Mishnah is specifically talking about shchitas, so let's talk about slaughtering, but the Gemara is going to talk about all the avodas adam, the rest of the avodas adam as well. Fine. Okay, fine. So we had said, the Tanna Kama had said specifically the only by korban chatas and a korban pesach. Rabbi Eliezer adds in asham as well. Okay. Yossi ben Choni, Omer says, Yossi ben Choni, hanishchotin l'shem pesach u'l'shem chatas psulin. So Rabbi Yossi ben Choni says, what goes around comes around. Just like if one slaughters a chatas, let's say, with the intention of an ola, so it's pasul. So also fakert. If one slaughters an ola or a shlomin or a chveizvus, if one slaughters any korban as a chatas, so also it's going to be pasul. Just like if one slaughters a chatas as an ola, for example, the korban is pasul. So also if someone slaughters a ola as a chatas, it's also going to be pasul. But the same thing as if somebody slaughters an ola as a korban pesach on the 14th, on the afternoon of Erev Pesach. So also, because that's the afternoon of Erev Pesach is the only time when it's actually relevant to offer a korban pesach. Any other time would just be a korban shlom, right? I mean, the rest of the year it's not shaykh to slaughter anything as a korban pesach. It's not the time of the korban pesach. Okay, so that when we're talking about korban pesach, we're talking about on the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, which is the window to offer the korban pesach. Shimon Achi Azariah, Omer says, Shimon Achi Azariah. Who's Shimon Achi Azariah? So Taka Rashi explains, very interesting. Shimon Achi Azariah, Shimon who was the brother of Azariah, Shimon and Azariah had some kind of like a Yisachar Zvulun kind of thing going on. That Azariah was in business, and Azariah would make money in business and support his brother Shimon. So he was called Shimon Achi Azariah. And he says, as I mentioned in the introduction, that the Kochim is more stringent and kind of on a higher level than Kochim Kalam. So Says Shimon Achi Azariah, Omer, Shchoton l'shem gavoya me'en ksherim. So if a korban was slaughtered for something on a higher level from them, then it is ksherin. L'shem namuch me'en psul. But for something lower than psul, ketzad how so? Kochim sheshchoton l'shem kochim kalim psulin, kochim kalim sheshchoton l'shem kochim ksherin. So it says Shimon Achi Azariah. So for example, if you have a kodshim, for example, an ola that you slaughtered as a kodshim kalim, for example, a shlamim. So if you slaughter an ola with the intention that you're slaughtering a korban shlamim, pasul, even though it's not a chatas or a korban pesach, but if you're slaughtering an ola, which is kodshim, as a shlamim, which is kodshim kalim, that is going to be pasul. Now, if it's the inverse, if you're slaughtering a shlamim as an ola, a kochim kalim as a kochim, well then kosher. And taka, it's a shaila if it means kosher like kosher ve'alu l'baylim shem chova, or if it means like the Tanna Kama was saying, it's kosher, just that it's not pasul. It's kosher, but it's not going to count as it's not going to fulfill the obligation of the owner. So it's unclear right now if kosher here means completely kosher or just not pasul, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation. But anyways, so Shimon Achi Azariah makes this distinction that when we say that he further details that and says that is specifically when you have a kodshim kalim being slaughtered with the intention of a kodshim. Habechor ve'amaiser sheshchoton l'shem shlomim, a korbin bechor. Bechor is the firstborn animal that is male. So if you have like a sheep that gives birth to a male sheep and it is the firstborn, so that will be given to the kohen, and the kohen will offer it as a korbin, as well as meiser. Meiser is every 10th animal. So if you have a flock of sheep, so then you will take once a year, every 10th, I believe it's once a year, every 10th animal, and you will bring that to Yerushalayim and eat and offer those as korbanos, eat them as a shlomim, but they are on a lower level than a korbin, a regular korbin shlom. So b'chor v'maiser sheshchoton l'shem shlomim ksherin, because they're on a lower level. If you slaughter them as a shlomim, which is on a higher level, so then ksherin shlomim sheshchoton l'shem b'chor l'shem maiser psulin. But a shlomim which is slaughtered as a b'chor or a maiser, so because those are on a lower level, says Shimon Achi Azariah that those would be psulin. Says the Gemara, Lamali lemisna ela shlo alu lisnei vilo alu lebalim b'shem chova. What do you think about that kasha? What do you think of that kasha? Rashi says something very interesting. What does he say? Lamali lemisnei ela laharich bilshano. Why does the Mishnah have to be so long-winded as to use the word Ella? Why does the Mishnah have to say it could have just said Vilo Alu. Why did it have to be so long-winded as to say Ella Shelo? Okay. Doesn't sound that long-winded to me, but okay. Why? The Gemara wants to know. What it's teaching is what it's saying is that the only issue with these korbanis, if you slaughter a, let's assume like the Tanakama, without getting into Shimon Achi Azariah with the kodshim kal. According to the Tanakam, the only exceptions are the Korban Chatas and the Pesach. Other than that, we're saying if you slaughter a Korban Shlomim as a Korban Ola, we're saying all good. All good. Ella. One thing is not all good, which is Shalo Alu Lebailin L'Shem Chova, and they'll have to bring another one if they had an obligation. Other than that, totally kosher. Again, what it's teaching us is the only thing is that it was but the korbin for all other intents and purposes remains just as holy as ever. But also the shanuye and you can't change anything else. You can't just throw in the towel and say, all right, well, I already slaughtered the Shem Chova, let me do all sorts of other bad things with this korbin. Okay, I already slaughtered Shalol Lishma, whatever, so let's do everything else Shalol Lishma. No, everything else has to still be done to the T. If you have a korbin Ola that you slaughtered as a Shlomim, let's say, also there's Ogdama Shalol Lishma. It's forbidden to throw in the towel and say, okay, well, I'll also do Zrika Saddam, Shalol Lishma. No. Okay, so you did Shrita Shalol Lishma, but do the Zrika Saddam Lishma. Do everything else properly. And I'll tell you why. Either I could tell you logically, or I could tell you versically. I feel like versically is probably a word that I've used in the past. Versically. The logically being Mishum Deshani Ba Kolani Deshani Ba Vleza, what? Just because you made one mistake, make a million mistakes? Okay, so you made one mistake. You slaughtered Shalom Lishma. Don't now start being mistake boy. Do everything else properly. Just because you made one mistake, don't throw in the towel and say, okay, now you're just going to mess up everything. Lo ma pitum. Alternatively, I could make the argument from the Torah itself that the pasuk says in Devarim, Moitzis, it's a very interesting pasuk, friends. Moitzis vasecha tishma vasisa kashana darta l'shem aleikecha nedava. Continues the pasuk, Asher dibarta b'ficha. I just read that in the pasuk. Again, Moitzis vasecha tishma vasisa. Whatever comes out of your mouth, guard and do. Now listen to this, chavra. Kashana darta neder l'shem aleikecha nedava. Weird, right? Kashana darta l'shem aleikecha nedava. Like you nedered a nedava. You don't neder a nedava, you neder a neder. Or you nedava a nedava. What does it mean? You nedered a nedava. No. Hi nedava. Nederu. Right? It says kasha nadarta. Hashem lekech nedava. This nedava is really, should be a neder. We said kasha nadarta. Why are we talking about nedavas? Ella. Chaber, listen up. Im kimasha nadarta. Osisa. Yeh neder. V'im lav. Nedava yeh. The Nadav Mishoy L'Shenu Yeba. Chavi, you got it? I'm going to drink a little more water. Chavi, who can tell me what the difference is between a neder and a Nadava? Apparently it's a Mishnah in Kinim. I learned Kinim ages ago. Interesting Masechta. Tricky Masechta. It's just Mishnayos. There's no Gemara on Kinim. Anyways, who could tell me the difference between a neder and a nedava? A neder is when one says, I'm going to bring a korbin. Let's say, it doesn't have to be a shlom, but let's say a shlom. Person says, I'm going to bring a korbin shlom. Okay, so he has an obligation to bring a korbin shlom. And if he sets aside a korbin and that korbin dies, so set aside a different korbin. You said you're going to bring a korbin shlom, and until you properly bring and offer a korban shlomin, you have this obligation until you fulfill it. Now, a nedava, that was a neder. A nedava is when you say, this animal over here, I am going to bring as a korban shlomin. Well, if that animal dies, well, obviously you're not going to be bringing it as a korban shlomin. And you're done over here, Kelu. You said you were going to bring this animal as a korban shlomin. It died. Malasot. You have no other obligation. Your obligation was to bring this animal. If you can't bring this animal, so the obligation is gone. You don't have any achrayis. You don't have to follow up on anything. So what's this talking about? I'll tell you what it's talking about. What's the deal with this neder and nedava? If we're talking about a person who made a neder, a person says, I'm going to bring a korban. Let's say a korban shlom. In our example, he brings a korban shlom. So he says, I'm going to bring a korban shlom. So he has to bring a korban shlom. And until he brings a korban shlomim properly, he has an obligation to bring the korban shlom. Now, what happens if he comes to offer a korban shlom, but he slaughters it as an ola? So we say, lo olu b'alim shem chova. We say, okay, well, it's kosher, but it doesn't fulfill his obligation. He's still going to have to bring a new korban as a shlomim, because this korban, this korban is going to be treated as a nedava. What does it mean as a nedava? Well, it's not going to be fulfilling his obligation since he had to bring a shlomim, but he slaughtered it as an ola. So this korban, right? This lashon of nedava was harei zeh. This korban now becomes a separate nidava. This is not to fulfill your obligation, your neder, because since you slaughtered it with the intention of a ola and you needed to slaughter with the intention of a shlamim, so this becomes a separate nidava. This animal is now a separate korban, and yes, you're going to offer this korban, this new animal as a korban, as a nidava, and a nidava needs to be offered properly. And you have to do all the steps to this korban that you're now offering. You're going to have to offer it properly. Do all the steps to this korban properly. Now, again, this isn't going to be the korbin to satisfy your neder, because your neder was a shlomim, and you slaughtered it l'shem ola. So your neder still stands, and this neder is now a separate nedava that you have to offer properly and kosherly. But it's no longer going to satisfy your neder. So if kasher nadarta Hashem Elokecha nedava is talking about a scenario where you made a neder that you're going to bring a korbin shlomim, and you come and you bring an animal and you're going to fulfill your neder, but you slaughter it l'shem ola. Well, this is no longer going to be for the neder. It's going to be a separate. This particular animal is now going to be a separate nedava, which you have to offer properly and do all the avodas of that nedava properly. But it's no longer for your neder, and that's the deal. It started out as a neder, but because you slaughtered it for shalol lishma, it now becomes a separate nedava, which you have to offer properly. So again, elaim kimashana darta asi. So if, as you made your neder, that I'm going to bring a korbin shlomim, for example, if you did so, you slaughtered it as a korbin shlomim, you did everything as a korbin shlomim, perfect, you fulfilled your obligation. Yehei neder, that's your neder, you fulfilled your neder. You're off the hook now. But ve'im lo, but if you didn't do everything properly, if you slaughtered the shlomim as an ola, well then, nidava yehei, then this korbin that you're offering is not going to be for your neder, it'll be a separate nidava. V'nidava, mishray l'shanu yiba, what? Now by nidava, are you allowed to just start doing things shalol l'shma and improperly? Of course not. You have to do that properly. So even though you messed up and you were supposed to slaughter as a shlomim and you slaughtered as an ola, okay, so it won't count as your neder, but don't just throw in the towel. Continue doing all the avodos properly, even though it's now a separate neder. It's no longer the neder, but the original neder. But from this point on, make sure that you're doing everything kimeitav yecholtecha, as best as you can. And now we move on to the next section of today's daf: slaughtering a korbin with no intent at all. Okay, this is gewaldig. So far we've discussed slaughtering, let's say, a shlomim with the intention of a shlomim. I'm slaughtering this shlomim as a shlomim. Mazel tov. We've also discussed what happens if you say, I'm slaughtering this korbin as an ola. We said that that's shalol lishma. What happens if you have an undefined intent? What happens if you don't say I'm slaughtering a shlomim, you don't say I'm slaughtering an ola, you just slaughter the animal? What happens then? Very interesting, and we're going to see a discussion. We're going to compare and contrast korbanis and gittin. I remember Masechta Gittin. Here we go. Amalei Ravina leRav Papa. Says Ravina to Rav Papa, lehavis gabon beorta betchuma becharmech de rami rava mile ma'al yusa adade v'shani lehu. Ooh. Ravina says to Rav Papa, chaval, you weren't here on Shabbos. I guess this was maybe so I saw him maybe on Sunday or something. And he says to Rav Papa, chaval, you weren't with us for Shabbos in the Tchum of Beicharmach. You weren't within the Tchum Shabbos of Beicharmach. You were unable to be with us for Shabbos because Rave gave a shir on Shabbos, and it was some shir. Now, it's very interesting because I was under the impression that Ravina did not overlap with Rava. Now, maybe this was a different Ravina than like Ravina and Ravashi. I don't know, because the Gemara, we learned the Gemara in Kiddushin, which says that when Rave died, Ravashi was born. And Ravina, I believe, was younger than Ravashi. Anyways, maybe not. I don't know. Akoponim. So Ravina says to Rav Papa, your mamish missed out because yesterday, Ravina says to Rav Papa, your mamish missed out yesterday because yesterday on Shabbos, Rava gave some droshe. Again, Ravina says to Rav Papa, lehavis gabon beorta. Rav Papa, you weren't with us last night, betchuma, at the Tchum Shabbos, Beichermach, within the Tchum Shabbos, Beichermach. The Rami Rave, minim al yusadade, because Rave had asked a question, he had compared and contrasted two conflicting scenarios, Vishanilu, and he resolved them. My milim al yusa. No, tell me, what was this gewaldige thing? What was the kasha? What were the contradictory scenarios that he answered? Here they are. It's not. We learned in our Mishnah. Kol as vachim shenizbechu shelo lishmon chulei time de shelo lishmon hastame alunami levadim shem choy v'amastame nami klishmon dami. Says Rave, and building up the question he asks from our Mishnah. That our Mishnah says, but again, it's not. We learned in our Mishnah. I'm reading again. Kol as vachim shenizbechu shelo lishmon. Our Mishnah says that any animal that is offered shelo lishman, so if you have a shlomim and you deliberately, explicitly slaughter it, for example, as an ola, you slaughter a shlomim as an ola, so because you deliberately slaughtered it as something else, as an ola, so we say, lo alu lebaylam shem chova, it will not fulfill the obligation of the owner. Talmud de shelo lishman. The reason why it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner is because he had deliberate intention for the wrong korbin. Slaughtered a shlomim as an ola. Hostame. What if he was an undefined intention? He didn't say, I'm slaughtering it for this type of korbin or that type of korbin. He took his animal, he slit its throat. Alunami lebaylam l'shem chova. Well, in that case, completely good. If the intention is wrong, bad. But if there's no intention at all, if it's an undefined intention, it will simply default to being kosher, no problem. So almastame nami kalishon dami, that we treat an undefined intention like a lishma intention, a kosher intention. If you're slaughtering a korban shlomim with an undefined intent, we assume that it's for a shlomim, we assume that it's kosher. But verimini, but I'll ask you a kasha from Gittin. Kol haget shenichtov shelo l'shem isha, we have the same type of lashon by Gittin. Any get that was written not for this woman, but for a different woman. Okay, so you have Reuven is married to Sarah, and you have the get, and Reuven wants to divorce Sarah. Now the get was not written for Sarah, but for a different Sarah. But obviously, if it's written Rivka, so then obviously it's a different person. But if the get was written not for this Sarah, but it was written for a different Sarah, so again, call aget, any writ of divorce, shenichtav shelo l'shem isha, that was written not for the intended recipient, but for somebody else with the same name. Pasul, that get is pasul. And there, v'stamenami pasul. And there, an undefined intent defaults to being pasul. What's an example of an undefined intent? We're actually going to get to it later on the daf. But let me drink a little water. So there's like kind of three type of possibilities. One possibility is that a get is written for the intended recipient, right? Reuben's divorcing Sarah. They come to the sofer, to the scribe, and he writes a get for Sarah, for the recipient. That's perfect. The other option is that he dafka writes it for somebody else named Sarah. Dafka, like literally, he wrote it for a different woman. We said that that's possible. But you know what else is possible? Let's say you have a scribe, a sofer, and he's got some extra time one afternoon, and he says, or maybe this is a common thing that he does, whatever it is, he writes again, right? He writes a get, Reuven, Sarah, and he has them ready so that if somebody named Reuven comes into the shop and says, hey, my wife's name is Sarah, and we're getting divorced, he says, I already wrote the get with all the names and everything like that. Just go, take it. That'll be $50. So that would be kind of an undefined intent. The sofer didn't have anybody in mind. Didn't have in mind this woman, the recipient, because he didn't, at the time, he was just writing, or he didn't have in mind anybody else. He just wrote a get. He filled in Reuven, Sarah. If somebody named Reuven comes in and he's getting married, divorced to somebody named Sarah, he'll be able to use it. So that's an undefined intent. And when it comes to Gittin, pasul. So Rava asks, it's kind of weird. You have a Mishnah in Zevachim, you have a Mishnah in Gittin. They seem to be saying the same thing. That, in Zevachim it says, if the animal was slaughtered not for an ola, or not for a shlamim, but for an ola. And in Gittin it says, if the get was written not for this sarah, but for that sarah. And yet when it comes to shlamim, we say an undefined intention defaults to kosher, whereas by Gittin, we say an undefined intent defaults to pasul. How come? Umishani, and Vishani, and he answers, Zevachim bistam lishman omdin. And we're going to explain this basically for the rest of the daf. That when it comes to a korbin bistam lishman omdin, by default they are lishma. They default to lishma. We're going to explain how we know this coming up now. Whereas isha bistam alav legerishin omedes, masha ein kain, by divorce. We don't assume that a woman is just standing to be divorced, and therefore, in order for a writ of divorce, in order for a get to be a kosher get, the intention, the lishma, must be specifically for this woman, but by default, an undefined intent will not default to kosher by a get. And how do we know? Okay, now now the Gemara is going to discuss how we know that by Zvachim, undefined defaults to kosher, whereas by Gittin, undefined defaults to pasul. So the Gemara asks, Zvachim b'stama ksher minol, and how do we know this? How do we know that by korbanis, undefined intent defaults to kosher? If you're going to say from our Mishnah, that any zebach, any korbin that is slaughtered specifically shelo lishman, if a shlamim is slaughtered specifically as an olive, for example, it's pasul. V'lo katani shelo nizbechu lishman. Now the Mishnah doesn't say any korbin that was not specifically slaughtered lishma is pasul. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say in the Mishnah that in order for a korbin to be kosher, it must be specifically slaughtered. If you have a korbin shlamim, it has to specifically be slaughtered as a shlamim, which would imply that if it wasn't specifically slaughtered as a shlamim, well then undefined would default to pasul. But it doesn't say that. It says the opposite. It says if the korbin was specifically slaughtered shelo lishma, the Mishnah says if a shlamim was specifically slaughtered as an ola, that's where it's pasul. But by default, it would default to kosher. But the problem with that argument is, but Gabi get nami, you have the same. The problem with that is that you have literally the same exact phrase when it comes to get. It says by get, kol get shenichtov shelo l'shema isha pasul. Any get that was not written for the particular recipient, but rather for somebody else is pasul, implying, right? It doesn't say, right? It doesn't say shelo nichtov l'shem isha pasul. It doesn't say by gittin, just like it doesn't say by kachim. It doesn't say by gittin that in order for the get to be kosher, it has to specifically be for this woman. It doesn't say that. It says by gittin that any get that was written for a different woman is pasul. And yet, we say that by default, it's pasul as well. So it can't be based on the fact, so again, getting back to the question of how do we know that by korbanos it defaults to kosher? It can't be based on the fact that the Mishnah says that, well, in order for it to be pasul, you have to specifically slaughter a shlamim as an ola. The thing is, in Gittin, we have the same phrasing, and yet Gittin defaults to pasul while here in Zevachim we default to kosher. Rather, it comes from the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel. Ketzad lishman v'shelo lishman. So let's actually maybe take a look quickly at the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel. What does Mishnah say on Daf Yud Gimel? Okay, so the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel, which might be the next Mishnah, says Pesach ve'achatos sheshchoten shelo lishman kibel ve'holach ve'hilach maybe ve'zorak shelo lishman. Right. So the Mishnah says that a chatos or a Pesach that was slaughtered shelo lishman, or the Kabbalah Sadam, Molacha Sadam, Zrika Sadam, if any of those things were done shelo lishman, but then it says O lishman v'shelo lishman or shelo lishman v'lishman psulim. Additionally, even if they were, let's say, slaughtered lishman v'shelo lishman, and we can explain what that means, or shelo lishman v'lishman, those are also psulim. So now, what does that mean? Lishman v'shelo lishman, shelo lishman v'lishman. So again, el me'od the time. Now it's on Daf Yud Gimel. Ketzad lishman v'shelo lishman. When we say lishman v'shelo lishman is possible, what does that means? It means that if you slaughter the korbin, for example, and you have two intentions, right? You have to bring a korbin shlamim, let's say. Oh no, it's definitely talking about Pesach and Chatos, so we'll use those examples as well. So you have a Chatos or a Pesach. I think actually we're going to use the example of Pesach. So you're slaughtering a korbin Pesach, and it's lishman v'shelo lishman. You're slaughtering it, and as you're slaughtering it, you have two intentions. One of them is lishman, one of them is shelo lishman. So l'shem Pesach, l'shem shlam. So you have two intentions while you're slaughtering the animal. If the intention is lishman v'shelo lishman, l'shem Pesach, which is lishman, and also l'shem shlam is shelo lishman. So time of Amr l'shem Pesach u l'shem shlam. So the reason why it's possible is because the two intentions were korbin Pesach, great, but also he specifically had the intention of shlamim. That's not great. That's a problem, and therefore it's possible. But hol l'shem Pesach v'stoma. But I can imply that if the intention was l'shem Pesach and l'shem undefined, kosher, it will default to kosher. So we want to be medayik from the Mishnah and Daf Yud Gimel, that from the fact that what's possible is l'shem Pesach v'l'shem shlamim, that he explicitly has the intention of shlamim, that's why it's possible, implying that undefined would be kosher. Alma stomon kalishman dami. So we see that undefined defaults to lishma and defaults to being kosher by kodshin, by korbanis. But dilma shani osan de Omer kola osa alda damiran kola osa alda asrishona hu osa. But says the Gemara, I'm not yet super convinced from that Mishnah, because that's talking about a scenario where he says davka l'shem korbin Pesach, and then he says l'shem shlamim, and we say it's possible because he specifically had the intention of shlamim. But if it's undefined, it would be kosher. But I can argue that if he first had the intention of korbin Pesach and then his intention was undefined, we say it's kosher. But maybe that's because the initial kavanah that he had was the correct one, korbin Pesach. So once he already initially had the correct kosher intention for korbin Pesach, followed by an undefined intention, so we say that it defaults to kosher. But Elam is Seifa, so rather let's actually learn it out from the Seifa, shelo lishman v'lishman. Okay. So it says there, if it's shelo lishman v'lishman, it's possible. So l'shem shlamim or l'shem Pesach, what does that mean? Well, if the first intention was shlamim, followed by intention of Pesach, we say it's possible. So time of the Omer l'shem shlamim l'shem Pesach. So I'll argue that the reason why it's possible is because the original intention was l'shem shlamim specifically, and then l'shem Pesach. But ostama l'shem Pesach. But if it's undefined and then l'shem Pesach, kosher. So the implication is it's kosher. Specifically when he has intention of l'shlamim and then the Pesach, that's possible. But undefined and then the Pesach, let's argue that it's kosher. So we see that even though the initial intention was undefined, it's still kosher. So let's say that by korbanis, an undefined intent defaults to a kosher intent. But But the Gemara is still not convinced. Because maybe there as well. What are we trying to resolve? We're trying to say that if one slaughters a korbin entirely with an undefined intent, it's kosher. All we've managed to do was bring a proof from a Mishnah which is talking about where you have a double intent. So we're saying, right, the Shem Pesach and the Shem some undefined intent. Whether the undefined intent was initially undefined or that was the second intention, but it's paired together with a kosher intention of Korban Pesach. What we really want to know is what happens if you entirely slaughter the animal with an undefined intent. Right, so maybe over there when we say undefined and then the Shem Korban Pesach, it's kosher. But maybe over there, Shani Yosem Damin Yochiach Sofa Tchilas. We'll say from the fact that he ultimately had the correct intention of Korban Pesach. So therefore, that is why we could say that the undefined intention defaults to the kosher intention of Korban Pesach. Inami, alternatively, you can argue that actually undefined would not be kosher. And the only reason why it says in the Seifa, the Shem Shlomim, the Shem Korban Pesach, is not to imply that undefined and then Korban Pesach would be kosher. No, that would be possible. It's just that we needed to be consistent with the Reisha. Right now, either the time of the Shman v'Shelo Lishman, since in the Reisha it says Lishman v'Shelo Lishman, Pesach and Shlomim. So Tanami Shelo Lishman Lishman, so it also says Shlomim and Pesach, but that isn't to imply that undefined and Pesach would be kosher. I would argue that undefined and Pesach is not kosher. We would say that Pesach and Shlomim is possible, implying that Pesach and undefined is kosher. That's because the initial intention was Pesach. And then we say, and Shelo Lishman Lishman, Shlomim and Pesach is possible, but that's not to imply that undefined and Pesach is kosher. I'll argue that it's possible, but the reason why we say Shlomim and Pesach is just to be consistent with the Reisha, which says Pesach and Shlomim. So again, we haven't successfully proved that slaughtering an animal with an undefined intent, mitchila v'ad sof, defaults to being kosher. We couldn't be medayek it from our Mishnah. We couldn't be medayek it from the Mishnah on Yud Gimel. But now we're going to try to be medayek from the Mishnah on Daf Mem Vav, which I had mentioned, I believe, in the introduction earlier. So Elo Meho. So rather, it comes from the following Mishnah on Daf Mem Vav. The Shem Shisha Devar Mazevach Nizbach. That there are 6 things that the korbin is offered for. The Shem Zevach, the Shem Zoveach, with the intention of the correct korbin, a shlomim needs to be offered as a shlomim. And also for the right person. If the korbin is for Reuven, it has to be slaughtered for Reuven, not for Shimon. The Shem Hashem, you have to have in mind the Rabbanu Shalom. The Shem Ishim, also for the fires, that you shouldn't just be having the intention of a barbecue. You should have an intent of burning it on the mizbech. The Shem Reach, also that it should smell like cooking. It should smell like a barbecue. It should smell good, right? You can't, if you already cooked the meat and now you're putting on the mizbech and it's not going to have a pleasant smell because whatever smell was already released, that's no good. It has to have a pleasant smell. The Shem Nichoach, and also Nachas Ruach to the Rabbanu Shalom, that the Yidden are offering korbanos. The Chatas v'Asham, the Shem Chet, additionally, a korban Chatas, a korban Asham, you have to have in mind the sin that is being brought for. Omer Rabbi Yossi, now this is the key, says Rabbi Yossi, Af mi shelo haya belibo l'shem achas mikol elu kosher. And even somebody who didn't have it in his heart specifically for any of these things is still kosher. Even if when slaughtering the shlomim, you didn't have specific intent for shlomim, it's still kosher. Shetanai Bezdinu, because Bezdin made a Tanai, Bezdin made a takana that Shetanai Bezdin, who Asnu Bezdin dilo lema lishmo, dilma asa the mema shelo lishmo. Bezdin said specifically that actually if you're offering a korbin shlamim, do not specifically have intention for korbin shlamim, because we're actually concerned that if we say to specifically have intention for korbin shlamim, you might end up intending for an olah. We say, you know what, just don't have any specific intention at all. Have an undefined intent in order to avoid a scenario where you're going to have the wrong intent. Now, some apostle, and if it enters your mind that an undefined intent by korbanis is possible, how could Bezdin say, have an undefined intent, don't intend for anything, just have an undefined intent? How could they say have an undefined intent if having an undefined intent is possible? Clearly from the fact that Bezdin says have an undefined intent in order to avoid a situation where you have the wrong intent. So just have an undefined intent must be that clearly having an undefined intent by korbanos defaults to being kosher. So there you have it, that when it comes to korbanos, the default intention, the undefined intention defaults to kosher when it comes to korbanos, which is why Rabbi Yossi says that Bezdin was able to suggest when you slaughter a korban, don't have any intention at all in order to prevent a scenario when they'll have the wrong intention, and then by default the undefined intent will default to being kosher by korbanos. And now finally, how do we know that writing a writ of divorce with no intent at all defaults to being possible? Okay, we just learned, how do we know that by a korbin, an undefined intent defaults to being kosher? How do we know that by a get, an undefined intent, that when a get is simply written without any particular woman in mind, it's a possible get? So the gabi get, when it comes to get, the stome posel minol. And how do we know that by a get, an undefined intention by gittin is possible? Ilim, if we're going to say me'oditnan from the following Mishnah from Masechta Gittin, maybe you remember it. Haya over bashok, a guy, let's call him Ruvain, was walking in the market. Vishama kol sofrim makrin, and he heard the sound of the scribes, and they were reading out Ish ploni migarish as plonis, and he hears Ruvain is divorcing Sarah mimokim ploni from such and such a place, v'amar. And Ruvain says, wait a second, this sounds like a great idea. Zeshmi v'zeshem ishti, that's my name, that's my wife's name. Why? Let's do it. Okay, maybe today's the day I'll get divorced. Posel garish bo. So it's a posel get. It's a posel get. So we want to say, why is it posel? Because it didn't have the proper kavana. But dilma kidu apop. Maybe the reason why that is a posel get is like Rav Papa says. That was talking about what he was hearing coming from the scribe shop was pupils, students learning how to write documents. They didn't even, what was, v'lo irto v'shum kreisus klau. These weren't gittin, these were practice. These were just a means to practice. Nobody was writing these documents with any intention of them being for divorce and being a safer krisus. They were just learning how to write, that's all. So you can say that that's why it doesn't work, because these aren't actually divorce documents. They're just practice documents. And therefore, that's why it doesn't work. It's not going to prove that an undefined intent by gittin is possible. Ella. Mihot. From the following, Yosser al-Kain continues the Mishnah in Gittin and says, and even more so, Kosav l'gayrishas ishto, a person who writes a get to divorce his wife, v'nimlach, and then he changed his mind, mitzvah beniro, but then somebody in his city finds him. He says, wait a second, v'amalo shmi kishimcha, v'shemishte kishemishtecha. And he says, wait a second, your name's Reuven, my name's Reuven, your wife's Sarah, my wife's Sarah. Wait a second, maybe I can have your get. If you're not going to use it, maybe I can have it. Posel legarish bo. You say that that's a posel get, but Dilmashani also to integrate the shem gerishin de'ahu. But 1 second, obviously that get is not good because it was written for a different person. The get was written for the initial sorrow. It wasn't written for the second guy's sorrow. So obviously that's not going to work. So elo, rather from here, Yasser al Kain, and even more so, yesh lo shtei nashim. If Reuven has 2 wives, the first one's name is Sarah, and the second one's name is also Sarah. Shesh Moshe and Shavuos, wow, he's married to 2 women with the same name. Okie dokie. Kosel legarish es agdola. So if he writes a get to divorce the older one, legarish bo katana, he shouldn't divorce the younger one. But Dilmashan Yosem de interclay the Shem Gerishin Da'i. The Gemara says, but wait a second. Maybe the reason why that doesn't work is because it was specifically written for the older wife. You can't use it for the younger wife. This isn't an undefined intention, it's a specific intention for the other wife. So of course you can't use that. Ella, meha, rather for me, also, okay, and even more so, Omer the Lavler. If Reuven says to the scribe, V'le'ezeh she'ksov, v'le'ezeh she'ertze agaresh, posel agaresh bo. Interesting. So now we're getting closer. What if Reuven says to a scribe, look, just write me a document, just write me a get, say Reuven, Sarah, and then later on, I will decide who I want to give it to. So it sounds like we're getting closer. Okay, just write me a get, stam, undefined, and later on I'll decide who it's for. And we say that is still possible. But Dilma Shani also, maybe it's different over there. They ain't breira. So they would say breira, meaning so this is interesting. If I understand correctly, because basically what's happening is he's writing it for one of them, right? He knows he wants to divorce one of his wives, right? So he's writing a get for one of his wives. We're just going to decide later on which it is. So it's not like where it was written undefined. It's not like a get that's written completely undefined. Like we had mentioned earlier, you have a sofer in his shop who just writes a get randomly. He doesn't know who's going to buy it. Some guy comes in and says, I'm Reuven, and my wife is Sarah. Can I have this document? That's completely undefined. Here it's not completely undefined. He's having a get written up because he knows that he wants to divorce one of his wives. So we're concerned that maybe he had intention for one of the wives when he was writing the get, and he can't later on give it to one of them because maybe I didn't mind the other one. We don't say breira, right? We don't say kind of breira. I'm talking about breira for years, right? That was like the Photoshop thing, right? The fact that ultimately he gives it to, let's say, the younger wife means that Mamela all along it was meant for her. We don't say that, and we're concerned that maybe when he had this get written, maybe he had in mind maybe he had in mind the other wife, and by giving it to the other wife, right? Let's say he had in mind the older wife, if he gives it to the younger wife, we don't say that shows that it was really all along for her. We don't say breira, and therefore that is why it's kosher. That's why it's possible, because we're concerned that maybe he had in mind the wrong wife. After all, he had it written because he knew he wanted to divorce one of his wives. So it's not like completely undefined. Rather from here, Hakosev Tov Segitin, if you have a scribe, okay, if you have a sofer, and he wants to write get templates, okay, so if somebody comes into the shop and says, hey, do you have a get for me? He says, yeah, look, I have a template over there. So that's fine, but he's just going to have to leave out certain details that will be written in later, at the time, right, to customize it later on. Mukom ha'ish, the place for his name, Mukom ha'isha, the place for her name, Mukom ha'edim, and place for the witnesses to sign, Mukom hazman, and the time, the date, V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, u'makom azman, Shmuel, avtzorch she'eniach makom, harei mutaris l'kol adam, says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, you also have to leave space for harei mutaris l'kol adam, because that's kind of the main thrust of the get. So we see from this Mishnah that you can't, if you're a scribe, you cannot just write a get and have it fully written in advance, so that if one day somebody named Reuven, who's married to somebody named Sarah, comes in, he says, oh yeah, just take it off the shelf. That won't work, because undefined defaults to apostle, he's going to have to leave out. He's going to have to leave a space for his name, her name, etc., so that when the time comes, you'll fill it out specifically for the intended recipient. But otherwise, just have a get written in advance with no defined intent would default to being apostle. So there you have it. We've proved it from the Mishnah in Gittin. So when it came to korbanis defaulting to being kosher, we learned that out from the Mishnah in Zevachim and Daf Mem Vav. And when it came to Gittin defaulting to being apostle, we learned it out from a Mishnah in Gittin that's over there on Daf Chaf Vav, I believe. Friends, that was the first daf of Masechta Zevachim. We began today's daf with an introduction to Masechta Zevachim, where we talked about basic concepts like the different types of korbanos and kachim kalim and Maaseh Adam and Avodas Adam and pigul and all sorts of things, just to kind of get the ball rolling from Masechta Zevachim. We then began the first daf of Masechta Zevachim and the first Mishnah of Masechta Zevachim. We discussed slaughtering a korbin with the wrong intent. So when it comes to a daf, specifically a korbin chatos or a korbin pesach, if you slaughter them, let's say with the intention of an ola, apostle. All others would be kosher. So let's say we're talking about an ola or a shlamim, and you have intention for a meiser. So kosher, the animal the korbin will still be kosher, but does not fulfill the owner's obligation. So if it was a nedava, for example, if he said, I'm going to bring a korbin shlamim, but then he slaughters it as an ola, the korbin will be kosher, but he'll still have to bring a separate korbin shlamim to fulfill his neder. We discussed slaughtering a korbin with no intent at all. So when it comes to a korbin, when it comes to Zevachim, so an undefined intent defaults to being kosher. And we learned that from a Mishnah on Daf Mem Vav of Masechta Zevachim. And finally, we said writing a writ of divorce, a get, with no intent at all, not kosher by default, defaults to being apostle. And we learned that from a Mishnah in Masechta Gittin. Chevre, that was Daf Beis, the very first Daf of Seder Kodshim. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you tomorrow. Cheers.